He told her to leave without even looking up. Minutes later, a single photograph on his desk proved that sending her away was the worst mistake of his life. Security noticed her too late. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the small figure had already slipped past the revolving doors and into the heart of the building, moving with a quiet determination that didn't match her age. The business center was all glass and steel, filled with the low hum of conversations, ringing phones, and hurried footsteps, yet no one expected a 5-year-old girl in a red t-shirt and a blue denim skirt to be running straight through it, barefoot or nearly so, her small sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. She didn't look around in wonder or fear. She didn't hesitate. She ran as if she had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times, even though she didn't know the rules of this place or how elevators worked. She only knew one thing, the single thought that had pushed her forward through every doubt and every warning her body tried to give her. He was here. The elevator doors closed just as a security guard shouted, and the girl pressed herself against the wall inside, her chest rising and falling too fast. Her blonde hair stuck to her damp forehead, and her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't cry. Crying wouldn't help. Her mother had told her that much, even if she hadn't said it out loud. When the elevator stopped and the doors slid open again, the hallway was quiet, lined with closed doors and soft carpet that swallowed the sound of her steps. She followed the sign with the company name, her blue eyes fixed ahead, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. The door to the office was open. Inside, a man sat behind a wide desk, his attention fixed on the papers in front of him. He was tall even while seated, broad-shouldered, dressed in an immaculate suit that looked like it had never known dust or wrinkles. His brown hair was perfectly styled, his posture rigid and controlled, as if the world bent itself around his schedule rather than the other way around. This was Ethan Collins, a millionaire, a man who owned buildings like this one, a man who was used to problems that could be solved with money or authority. The girl took one small step into the room. Ethan looked up sharply, irritation already forming on his face as he prepared to dismiss whatever interruption had dared to enter his space. His blue eyes met hers, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, though he didn't yet know why. "What is this?" he demanded, pushing his chair back as he stood. "Who let you in here?" The girl opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She hadn't expected the words to disappear like that, caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She took another step forward, lifting her hand as if to show him something, or maybe to steady herself, but before she could do either, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ethan glanced toward the door, panic flickering beneath his annoyance as he realized what this could mean for security, for appearances, for control. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want questions. "You have to leave," he said quickly, more sharply now, his eyes dropping to the desk as if looking at her any longer might complicate things. "Right now." The girl froze. She stared at him for a moment, her blue eyes wide and unreadable, then slowly lowered her hand. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She turned around and walked back toward the door just as the security guards arrived, their voices overlapping with apologies and explanations. She was escorted out as quietly as she had come in. The office fell silent again. Ethan exhaled and ran a hand through his hair, irritated, already trying to forget the interruption as he turned back to his desk. That was when he saw it. A photograph lay on the polished surface, slightly crooked, as if it had been placed there in a hurry. His eyes focused on it, and the breath left his lungs all at once. The woman in the picture was smiling softly, her face painfully familiar, her presence dragging him backward in time before he could stop it. Laura. His hand trembled as he reached for the photo, a chill spreading through him that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned room. Somewhere far down the hallway, a small girl was walking away, and for the first time in years, Ethan Collins felt the unsettling certainty that something he had buried long ago had just found its way back into his life. Ethan remained standing long after the door had closed, the noise of the hallway fading until the office felt unnaturally still. The photograph lay on his desk like a silent accusation, small and harmless in appearance, yet heavy enough to pull the air from his lungs. For a moment he didn't touch it, as if he feared that doing so would make everything real in a way he wasn't ready to face. When he finally picked it up, his fingers tightened around the edges. The image was slightly faded, the corners worn, as if it had been carried around for a long time, taken out and put back again more than once. Laura's face stared back at him, her smile soft and unguarded, the same smile she used to give him on quiet mornings before everything fell apart. Seeing it now felt like reopening a wound he had spent years convincing himself had healed. He sank into his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and let his head fall back as memories rushed in without permission. Laura laughing in his kitchen when he burned dinner. Laura standing in the doorway one night, asking him to choose between her and the life he was building, a choice he had avoided until it was already too late. Laura leaving with nothing but a suitcase and a look of disappointment he had never been able to forget. She had never told him she was pregnant. His eyes dropped to the desk again, and this time his thoughts went where he had been trying not to let them go. The girl's face flashed in his mind, her blue eyes far too familiar, the shape of her nose, the set of her mouth, the strange calm in her expression that hadn't matched her age. 5 years old. The timing lined up with a precision that made his stomach twist. No, he muttered to himself, though the word had no strength behind it. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it down again. Denial came easily to him, it always had. But the image of the child standing in his office, small and silent, refusing to leave his thoughts, made it impossible to dismiss what was forming in his mind. Ethan pressed the intercom. "Lock down the exits," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline in his veins. "And find the girl who just left my office. I want her brought back here, now." There was a pause, then a cautious reply. "Yes, sir." He stood again and paced the length of the room, the polished floor reflecting his restless movements. Every step felt too loud, every second stretching longer than the last. He told himself this was about responsibility, about security, about making sure the child was safe, but the truth pulsed beneath those excuses, sharp and undeniable. If he was wrong, he needed to know. If he was right, then his entire life had just been built on a lie. The door opened after several minutes that felt like hours. One of the guards stepped inside, his expression apologetic. "Sir, we lost her," he said. "She slipped away outside the building before we could stop her." Ethan's chest tightened. "Find her," he snapped, the control in his voice cracking. "Search the area. Call the police if you have to. She's alone." The guard nodded and left quickly. Ethan returned to his desk and stared at the photograph again, his thumb brushing over Laura's face as if the paper might suddenly warm under his touch. He wondered how long she had been sick, how long she had been planning this, how many nights she had spent deciding whether or not to send their daughter to him. The thought of Laura standing in a hospital room somewhere, trusting him with something so fragile after everything he had failed to be, made his throat burn. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of glass and steel, a small girl was walking through the city alone, carrying a future he had never known existed. And for the first time since he had built his empire, Ethan Collins felt truly powerless, haunted by the possibility that the most important part of his life had been standing right in front of him, waiting to be seen. Mia didn't run far after leaving the building, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had already exhausted her. The streets around the business center were wide and busy, filled with people who moved quickly and purposefully, each of them wrapped in their own lives. To them, she was invisible, just another small figure standing too close to the curb, clutching her arms around herself as if that might keep her from falling apart. She sat down on the low concrete edge near the entrance plaza, her legs drawn up, her red t-shirt wrinkled and her blue denim skirt dusty from the floor of the lobby. Only now, with the glass doors far behind her, did her hands begin to shake. She pressed her lips together tightly, refusing to cry, because crying felt like something that belonged to before, to a time when her mother had been strong enough to wipe her tears away. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and touched the empty space where the photograph had been. Leaving it on the desk had been the hardest part. It was the only picture she had, the one her mother had held onto even when everything else had been sold or given away. But her mother had said it was important, that he needed to see it, even if he didn't want to see her. Mia didn't understand adults very well, but she understood this much: sometimes they needed proof before they believed something mattered. Behind the glass walls of the building, Ethan moved like a man being pulled by an invisible force he couldn't fight. He ignored calls, brushed past assistants, and walked straight through the lobby with his gaze fixed ahead, scanning the area with a sharp intensity that made people step aside without knowing why. His suit jacket hung open now, his tie loosened, the carefully controlled image beginning to fracture under the weight of urgency. He spotted her near the curb almost immediately. She looked smaller outside than she had in his office, her confidence gone, replaced by a stillness that made his chest tighten painfully. For a moment he simply stood there, watching her from a distance, struck by the absurdity of it all. This fragile child, alone in the open, had walked into his life without warning and left him standing in ruins. He approached slowly, aware that sudden movements might scare her away. "Mia," he said, testing the name aloud, letting it carry gently across the short distance between them. She looked up at the sound of her name, her blue eyes locking onto his without surprise. It was as if she had been expecting him all along. "You came," she said quietly. Ethan crouched down in front of her, the concrete cold beneath his shoes, his height reduced so they were closer to eye level. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, and the realization hit him with a force that made it hard to breathe. The same eyes. The same shade of blue. The same serious, searching expression Laura used to wear when she was trying to decide whether to trust him. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Why did you leave?" "You told me to," Mia replied simply, not accusing, just stating a fact. The words cut deeper than any anger could have. He nodded slowly, accepting it. "I saw the photo," he said. "Your mother. Laura. Where is she?" Mia's gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her skirt. "She's in the hospital," she answered after a moment. "She's very sick." Ethan felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. "Why did you come to me?" he asked, even though part of him already knew the answer. Mia looked back up at him, her expression calm but tired, like someone who had already carried this question for too long. "She said if something happened to her, I should find you," she said. "She said you would understand." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Cars passed nearby, horns sounding in the distance, the city continuing on without noticing that something irreversible was happening on a quiet curb. Ethan reached out before he could stop himself, his hand hovering uncertainly near her shoulder. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear to you, I didn't know." Mia studied his face, as if weighing the truth of his words. "I think she knew that," she replied. For the first time since he had seen the photograph, Ethan felt something other than shock take hold inside him. It was fear, sharp and unfamiliar, mixed with a sense of responsibility so sudden and overwhelming that it left no room for denial. "Come with me," he said finally. "We'll go see her together." Mia hesitated only a second before nodding, pushing herself up from the curb. As she stood beside him, small and unsteady, Ethan realized with unsettling clarity that whatever he had been before this moment no longer mattered. Something had begun the instant she stepped into his office, and there was no turning away from it now. The hospital felt nothing like Ethan's world of glass offices and controlled silence. The air was thick with antiseptic and quiet tension, filled with sounds that couldn't be ignored or managed away, the distant beeping of monitors, soft footsteps in the corridors, murmured voices carrying exhaustion rather than authority. As they walked inside, Mia's small hand slipped into his without asking, her fingers cold but firm, as if she were anchoring herself to the only solid thing left. Ethan didn't pull away. They moved slowly through the hallway, Mia guiding him more than he guided her. She seemed to know exactly where to go, turning corners without hesitation, her steps careful but determined. With every step closer to the room, Ethan felt the weight in his chest grow heavier, memories pressing in from all sides. He hadn't seen Laura in years, not since the night she left and refused to look back, and now the idea of seeing her like this filled him with a dread he couldn't name. They stopped in front of a door that was slightly open. Mia paused, her grip tightening. "She's in there," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. He pushed the door open gently. Laura lay in the hospital bed, smaller than he remembered, her dark hair thinner, her skin pale against the white sheets. Tubes and wires surrounded her, silent witnesses to a battle that had already gone on far too long. Yet when her eyes shifted toward the door and landed on Mia, something in her face softened instantly, a fragile smile appearing as if summoned by sheer will. "Mia," she whispered. "You came back." Mia rushed forward, careful not to bump the bed, climbing onto the chair beside her mother and taking her hand with both of hers. Only then did Laura's gaze move past her daughter and settle on Ethan. The moment stretched. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by surprise, then something deeper and more painful, understanding. "So," Laura said softly, her voice weak but steady, "you finally found him." Ethan stepped closer, every instinct telling him to say something meaningful, something that could bridge the years of silence and resentment, but no words came. He simply nodded, his blue eyes fixed on her face, searching for the woman he had loved beneath the illness that had taken so much from her. "You weren't supposed to meet like this," Laura continued, her fingers tightening faintly around Mia's. "I hoped I'd have more time." "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan finally asked, his voice low and strained. "About her. About any of this." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, gathering what little strength she had. "Because you were already gone," she said quietly. "Not physically, but here." She tapped her chest weakly. "I didn't want her growing up waiting for someone who might never show up." Ethan swallowed hard, the truth cutting deeper than accusation ever could. Mia looked between them, sensing the tension even if she didn't fully understand it. "She didn't want to," Mia said softly, as if defending her mother. "But she said I should come anyway. Just in case." Laura smiled faintly at her daughter. "You were always braver than me," she murmured. Ethan stepped closer to the bed, lowering himself into the chair on the other side. For the first time, the distance between them wasn't measured in years or anger, but in inches. "I didn't know," he said again, more firmly now. "But I'm here. I'm not leaving." Laura studied his face, searching for the man she once knew, weighing whether she could trust him now, even this late. "I don't need promises for myself," she said softly. "I need one for her." Ethan looked at Mia, at her small hands wrapped around her mother's, at the seriousness in her eyes that no 5-year-old should have carried. "She won't be alone," he said without hesitation. "Not now. Not ever." Laura's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them. "That's all I needed to hear," she whispered. Outside the room, the hospital continued its endless rhythm, indifferent and relentless, but inside, something fragile and irrevocable had shifted. Past mistakes could not be undone, and time could not be reclaimed, yet in that quiet space between a dying woman, a child, and the man who had finally arrived, a truth settled in with painful clarity. This was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what still might be saved. The days after that first visit to the hospital unfolded with a strange, exhausting rhythm, as if life had decided to move forward whether any of them were ready or not. Ethan rearranged his schedule without thinking twice, canceling meetings, ignoring calls, leaving assistants confused and uneasy. For the first time in his career, numbers and contracts felt meaningless compared to the quiet urgency of hospital corridors and the small hand that now reached for his whenever Mia felt overwhelmed. Mia stayed close to him, not out of fear exactly, but out of instinct. She seemed to understand that things were fragile, that every moment mattered, and she treated time with a seriousness that made Ethan ache. In waiting rooms she sat beside him, swinging her legs slowly, sometimes leaning against his arm without asking, as if she had always belonged there. He never moved away. Laura's condition worsened in subtle but terrifying ways. There were days when she was awake and lucid, speaking in soft sentences, telling Mia stories about when she was younger, about silly mistakes and happy memories that felt like gifts being passed forward. Then there were days when she slept almost constantly, her breathing shallow, her body fighting a battle it was steadily losing. One evening, as rain streaked down the hospital windows, Laura asked Ethan to stay after Mia had been taken to the playroom by a nurse. The room felt smaller without the child's presence, the silence heavier. "You're trying," Laura said quietly, watching him from the bed. "I can see that." "I should have tried sooner," Ethan replied, his voice rough. "I can't change that, but I won't repeat it." Laura nodded slowly. "She's scared," she said. "She doesn't always show it, but she feels everything. She needs stability more than comfort." "She'll have it," Ethan said. "I'll make sure of it." Laura studied him carefully, as if measuring his words against the man she once knew. "You've built a world where everything bends to your will," she said softly. "But she won't. And that's not a failure." "I know," he said, though the truth of it unsettled him. "I want to learn." Laura smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at her features. "Then maybe this won't break her," she whispered. When Mia returned, she climbed onto the chair between them, instinctively placing herself in the space that connected them. She looked from her mother to Ethan, her expression serious. "Are you fighting?" she asked. "No," Laura said gently, reaching for her daughter's hand. "We're talking." Mia seemed satisfied with that answer and leaned back against Ethan's arm, her small body warm and solid against his side. The simple contact sent a wave of unfamiliar emotion through him, something dangerously close to peace. Later that night, Ethan drove Mia back to his house. The city lights blurred past the windows as silence settled between them, not awkward but thoughtful. When they arrived, he hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of how unprepared his home was for a child. Inside, the space felt cold and empty. Mia stood in the doorway, looking around with wide eyes, taking in the minimalist furniture and quiet corners. "Is this where you live?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "For now." She nodded slowly. "It's very big," she said, then added, "but it doesn't feel full." The word struck him harder than she could have known. That night, Mia slept on the couch, wrapped in one of his blankets. Ethan sat nearby long after she had fallen asleep, listening to her slow, steady breathing. He realized that this was no longer a temporary arrangement, no matter how carefully he tried to frame it in his mind. Something had shifted beyond logistics and responsibility. For the first time, Ethan Collins understood that staying was not a decision to be made once, but a choice that would have to be made again and again, especially when it was difficult. The truth did not arrive in a dramatic moment, nor did it come with raised voices or sudden revelations. It unfolded slowly, through paperwork, quiet conversations, and the kind of confirmations that left no room for interpretation. Ethan had spent his life trusting documents more than people, believing that facts were safer than emotions, yet nothing had prepared him for how devastating certainty could feel. It began with a question he could no longer avoid. One evening, after Mia had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled around a stuffed animal someone from the hospital had given her, Ethan stood alone in his kitchen, staring at a glass of untouched water. Laura's words echoed in his mind, not accusing, not bitter, just honest. She had needed stability for their daughter. She had needed certainty. And now, so did he. He contacted a private clinic quietly, efficiently, the way he handled everything else in his life. No assistance. No explanations. When he visited Laura the next day, he told her what he was doing, watching her face carefully as he spoke. She didn't look surprised. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said softly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked again, though the anger had faded, replaced by something heavier. Laura turned her gaze toward the window, where pale light filtered into the room. "Because I was afraid you'd fight for her like a possession," she said. "And I needed you to fight for her like a father." Ethan had no response to that. The test results came back 3 days later. He read them alone, sitting in his car in the clinic's parking lot, the engine off, the city noise muted by thick glass. The words were clinical, impersonal, but their meaning was absolute. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Ethan closed his eyes, his hands tightening around the steering wheel as his chest constricted painfully. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, faced public scrutiny and private loss, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. 5 years. 5 years of first words, first steps, first fears, all lived without him, all gone forever. He didn't go back inside the house right away. He stayed in the car, breathing unevenly, letting the weight of it settle. Regret came in waves, sharp and relentless, followed by a quiet terror he had never known before. This wasn't something he could fix with money or strategy. This was something he could only face. When he finally went inside, Mia was awake, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, watching him with an expression far too perceptive for her age. "You look sad," she said. Ethan sat down in front of her, lowering himself until they were eye level. For a moment he simply looked at her, taking in the familiar curve of her eyebrows, the intensity of her gaze, the way her mouth tightened when she was nervous. "I need to tell you something important," he said carefully. She nodded, serious now, bracing herself. He told her the truth slowly, choosing his words with more care than he had ever used in a boardroom. He explained who he was to her, not in biological terms she wouldn't understand, but in meaning, in responsibility, in presence. He told her that he hadn't known, that he was sorry, that he wasn't planning to disappear. Mia listened without interrupting, her face calm, almost thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So you're really my dad," she said finally. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "If you'll let me be." She considered that, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "My mom said you would be," she said. She just didn't know when. Something inside Ethan broke then, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. He pulled her into his arms without thinking, holding her carefully, as if afraid she might vanish if he loosened his grip. Mia leaned into him without resistance, resting her head against his chest as though it were the most natural thing in the world. From that moment on, everything changed. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because it became honest. Life did not slow down after the truth was spoken. If anything, it became heavier, as though naming what Ethan was to Mia had given weight to every choice that followed. Fatherhood did not arrive with clarity or confidence, but with constant uncertainty, quiet fear, and the exhausting determination to stay present even when he felt painfully unprepared. Laura's condition declined steadily. There were fewer good days now, fewer moments when her voice sounded strong enough to hide the truth. Mia noticed everything. She learned to read the rhythm of hospital rooms, the difference between nurses who smiled out of habit and those who smiled because there was real hope. She became quieter, more careful, as if she were trying not to take up too much space in a world that already felt like it was slipping away from her. Ethan took her to the hospital every day. Sometimes they talked in the car, sometimes they didn't. Mia would press her forehead against the window and watch the city blur past, while Ethan gripped the steering wheel, memorizing the weight of her presence beside him. He learned how to listen without fixing, how to answer questions without lies, and how to sit through silence without trying to escape it. One afternoon, Laura asked for some time alone with Ethan. Mia hesitated at the door, her eyes flicking between them. "I'll be right outside," Ethan promised, kneeling slightly so she could see his face. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, though her fingers lingered in his sleeve for a moment before she let go. Inside the room, Laura looked tired in a way that went deeper than her illness. Her breathing was labored, her strength visibly fading, but her gaze remained sharp and steady. "She knows," Laura said quietly. "About you." Ethan nodded. "I told her," he replied. "She took it better than I deserved." Laura smiled faintly. "She always was stronger than both of us," she said. "That's why I need to know something." Ethan leaned forward. "When I'm gone," Laura continued, "will you still choose her when it's hard?" The question landed heavily, stripped of sentiment and hope. This wasn't about promises made in comfort. This was about sleepless nights, grief-driven anger, moments when Mia would push him away because it hurt too much to stay close. "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "Even then." Laura closed her eyes briefly, relief softening her features. "That's all I wanted," she whispered. The end came quietly. It was early morning, the light pale and uncertain, when Mia shook Ethan awake on the couch in the hospital waiting room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she didn't cry. "She's not waking up," she said softly. They went into the room together. Laura lay still, her face peaceful in a way that felt both comforting and devastating. Mia climbed onto the chair beside the bed, taking her mother's hand and holding it tightly, as if warmth alone could change what had already happened. "I'm here," Mia whispered. "You can rest now." Ethan stood just behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, feeling her small body tremble beneath his touch. When the nurse finally spoke, when the words were said out loud, Mia didn't scream or collapse. She simply leaned back against Ethan's chest, and for the first time, truly let herself cry. The days after the funeral were the hardest. Grief did not follow rules or schedules. Some mornings Mia woke up quiet and distant, other days angry and restless, lashing out over small things she couldn't explain. Ethan learned quickly that love did not mean calming her down or making the sadness disappear. It meant staying when she pushed him away, apologizing when he failed, and showing up again the next day no matter how exhausted he felt. One night, after a particularly hard day, Mia sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by her drawings, tearing one of them into pieces. She should be here, she said suddenly. She promised. Ethan sat down beside her, the carpet cold beneath him. I know, he said. And it's okay to be angry about that. Mia looked up at him, tears streaking her face. You're still here, she said quietly. Yes, he answered. I am. She leaned into him then, resting her head against his arm, and for the first time since Laura's death, Ethan felt something settle inside him. Grief was still there, heavy and permanent, but it was no longer faced alone. Fatherhood did not make him whole. But it gave him purpose. And for Mia, it meant that even in loss, she had not been left behind. Time did what it always does, whether people are ready for it or not. It moved forward, quietly reshaping the sharpest edges of grief into something softer, something that still hurt but no longer cut with every breath. Months passed, marked not by dramatic changes but by small, stubborn signs of life continuing despite everything that had been lost. Mia started school. On the first morning, she stood in the hallway with her backpack clutched to her chest, her face tense and guarded. Ethan crouched in front of her, straightening a strap that didn't really need fixing, simply buying himself a moment. You don't have to be brave, he said gently. You just have to go inside. I'll be here when you come out. She studied his face carefully, as if checking whether this promise was real, then nodded and turned toward the classroom without looking back. Ethan stayed where he was until the door closed, feeling a strange mix of pride and fear settle in his chest. Their house changed with them. It was no longer quiet in the way it once had been. Mornings were messy and loud, filled with forgotten lunches and mismatched socks. Evenings meant homework spread across the dining table, cartoons playing too loudly in the background, and conversations that wandered from serious questions to silly observations without warning. Mia still had bad nights, still woke up sometimes crying from dreams where her mother was calling her name, but she no longer cried alone. Ethan learned the language of those moments. He learned when to speak and when to simply sit beside her, offering presence instead of answers. He learned that being a father was not about erasing pain, but about making room for it without letting it consume everything else. One afternoon, nearly a year after the day Mia had walked into his office, Ethan took her back there. The building looked the same from the outside, tall and imposing, all glass and steel, but to Mia it felt different now. She held Ethan's hand as they stepped inside, her grip firm but curious rather than afraid. People smiled at her as they passed, some of them kneeling to say hello, others simply waving. She noticed everything. This is where I found you, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. And where I almost sent you away, he replied. They entered his office, and Mia immediately noticed the desk. She walked over to it slowly and climbed into the chair he usually sat in, spinning just slightly before stopping herself. You look strange over there, she said, pointing at him. He smiled. Maybe this isn't where I belong anymore, he said lightly. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the desk, where a familiar photograph stood in a simple frame. Laura's smile looked just as warm as it always had. She's here, Mia said softly. Yes, Ethan answered. She always will be. That evening, back at home, they sat together on the couch, the lights dim, the day finally settling around them. Mia leaned against Ethan's side, her head resting comfortably against his arm, her body relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. Do you remember when you told me I had to leave? She asked suddenly. He exhaled slowly. I do, he said. I think about it a lot. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled faintly. If you hadn't said that, she said, I wouldn't have left the picture. And if I didn't leave the picture, you wouldn't have followed me. Ethan felt something warm and painful rise in his chest all at once. You're right, he said. I needed to see it. Mia shifted closer to him. I think, she said carefully, that my mom knew it would happen like this. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked down at the child beside him, at the daughter he almost never knew, at the life that had forced its way into his in the most unexpected, devastating, and beautiful way possible. She trusted you, he said finally. And she was right. Mia yawned and closed her eyes, sleep pulling her gently away. Ethan stayed still, letting the quiet settle around them, not empty this time, but full and steady. The story hadn't ended the way anyone would have chosen. Loss remained a part of it, permanent and undeniable. But it was no longer the only chapter. Because sometimes a door that opens at the wrong moment, a child who isn't supposed to be there, and a sentence spoken without looking up can become the beginning of a life that finally feels real.